So he probably is one of the most well-known people here at Thomas Edison Charter Schools. Both campuses already know him. You probably know that he's been in education for 10 years and that he's been serving in the National Guard for 16 years, which we appreciate. He has a bachelor's degree in music education with an emphasis in winds and percussion, and that's from Utah State University. He also has a master's degree in flute performance. I did not know that. But here's a few random things you might not know about Greg. In the color code personality scale, Greg's kind of a blue and a white, a good mix of both. His love language is quality time and acts of service. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. These are his favorite books: Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson, and The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. Those are his favorite books. He also has a certification in, I'm sure I'm going to say this wrong, Schulwerk, there we go, level 1, and it's a philosophy that combines the ideas of music, movement, and drama in a way that kind of mimics children's play. So that was something I did not know. His Myers-Briggs type is INFJ, is what it is, and he is only missing one organ, that is his appendix. He read this book, The Color Code, and said how much it had helped him and that he wanted to share it with everyone else. So we are excited to have him present this morning. So let's welcome Greg.
Hello everyone. I'm sure all of you have had an experience like this, where you were at parent-teacher conferences and a parent comes up to you and says, "Hey, I have this book that you should totally read," and you're like, "Yeah, I should totally read that." And then the next parent-teacher conferences come and they've given you the book and they're like, "Have you read that yet?" And I'm like, "No, but I'm totally going to do it this summer." So this book was one of those experiences. I started out with it like a year before I read it this summer, and I was thinking to myself, wow, this has a lot of application to what we do here at Thomas Edison. It has a lot of correlation to Glenn Latham and to growth mindset, and this is stuff I want to remember. So I got some notes of my own together and then decided, hey, well, it might be something else that's useful for the school. So I sent it into administration and asked, do you want a presentation on this? And they said yes. And so this is where this all comes from. The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle. The basic premise of this book is that talent is not born, it's grown. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we continue. So we've got an overview of how talent is developed here with the talent development diagram. Hopefully, by the time we get to the end, this should be familiar to everyone, and all of those terms you see up there will be familiar. But for right now, that's just where it is. So this book took all these different places around the world. The tennis court in Moscow, Brazilian soccer field, Dallas vocal studio that's produced some of the most familiar pop stars in the world right now, San Jose Inner City School, New York Music Academy, and an island in the Caribbean. All of these places were hotbeds of talent, where unusually high numbers of talented people were coming out of small areas and certain schools or certain coaching areas. The premise, the biological premise of this book, is that talent is basically a structure in our brain and nervous system called myelin. Myelin is a sheath of nerve fibers that surrounds the nerve fibers, sort of like a hot dog bun would a hot dog. We've got a picture of it here. You can see on the bottom here, especially, that we've got our nerve fiber and we have the myelin around that protects each nerve and each nerve fiber. Protection is not the only thing that myelin does. This quote gives a really fine example of why we want a myelinated system. Myelin is infrastructure, all right, but with a powerful twist. Within the vast metropolis of the brain, myelin quietly transforms narrow alleys into broad, lightning-fast superhighways. Neural traffic that once trundled along at 2 miles an hour can, with myelin's help, accelerate to 200 miles an hour. So as we wrap these nerve fibers, we can increase our signal speed by a factor of 100. Increasing signal speed is not the only thing myelin can do. It can also increase the speed that signals can fire along our nervous system. This is called the refractory time, and it can be increased by a factor of 30 as we work on building up our myelin. So overall, both of those things together can work to boost our overall capability of doing a task and using information by 3,000. It's over 9,000. In this case, it's over 3,000. So some things that myelin is: a sheath of nerve fibers. It prevents signal leakage, increases signal speed, and the more myelin, the better, basically. Some things that myelin does not do, or does not happen with it, it does not unwrap. Yesterday, our presentation talked about how some people's brains got wired in a certain way, and that had to be overcome in a new way. Myelin doesn't unwrap. You can never demyelinate your system. You can only give yourself a better, more efficient pathway to use in future. The only way that you lose myelin is through age or disease. And one of the most interesting things to me, because mostly when people talk about talent, they're like, oh, I wasn't born with that talent, that's not something my family has. Myelin is completely separated from genetics. Your parents do not give you pre-myelinated pathways. It's just not something that has been evolved into our DNA as we move forward. So we each start with a blank slate, and we learn things from our environment that help us to be primed for certain activities later. So, one of our first terms that we're going to talk about that was on our talent development diagram is deep practice. I love this quote by the chair of psychology, UCLA, Robert York. We think effortless performance as we think of effortless performance as desirable, but really it's a terrible way to learn. If we think about our growth mindset, this goes hand in hand with that. It's all about the mistakes that we make and how we deal with those as we move forward. So a quote from the book here: deep practice is built on a paradox, struggling in certain targeted ways, operating at the edges of your ability, where you make mistakes, makes you smarter. Or to put it in a slightly different way, experiences where you're forced to slow down, make errors, and correct them end up making you swift and graceful without you realizing it. So here are some general rules of deep practice that can be applied to any content area, but I will specifically break down for various content areas as we move along. So rule 1 is to chunk it up. One of the things that we do with this rule is absorb the whole thing. That's getting a picture of what it is that we're going to do. If it's a task, that's the task that we're going to do. If it's a piece of music, we get an idea of that piece of music by listening to it. We see something, we hear something, This is absorbing the task. The next element in chunking it up is obviously to make it chunky. We break it up into chunks that are manageable, that focus on specific skills that can be done and mastered individually. And the third idea within this rule is to slow it down. Slowing it down is so key to the process of myelin development. Because if we're making sure that we're doing the task correctly, then we myelinate that pathway in our nervous system and it becomes stronger. So one school that really showcases the benefits of this first rule is the Meadowmount School of Music. This is the academy in New York. Most of you have probably heard of two of the names that are up there, Aesop Perlman and Yo-Yo Ma. Conrad may recognize the other two names. He's nodding his head yes. But a string school where highly motivated students went in. These are not students that were low-level students. These were students who were already producing great work and doing great things. After 7 weeks in this school, on average, they typically learn a year's worth of material. Just 7 weeks, because of the ways that they use these rules of deep practice in their instruction of the students. A quote from a teacher here that illustrates that is, if a passerby can recognize the song being played, it's not being practiced correctly. I imagine in my head Dory from Finding Nemo using the whale voice and practicing in such an exaggerated, slow way to ensure that those correct pathways are getting myelinated. Some of you who are sports aficionados may be familiar with this man here. He's the one who took over for Madden. And Tom Martinez says, it's not how fast you can do it, it's how slow you can do it correctly. Our next rule is repeat it. We should repeat it. And repeat it, and do it again. The third rule is learn to feel it. Well, what does that mean? So, when students who have been in these deep practice situations have been asked about how they feel during these experiences, they've responded with certain adjectives. And these adjectives are attention, focus, connect, build, whole, repeat, tiring, alert, awake, and edge. Adjectives that are the antithesis of deep practice are natural, effortless, routine, and automatic. So if we're teaching something and we find ourselves with adjectives in this column, it may be a sign that our instruction or our deep practice is not quite as effective as it could be. So, yes, I promised we would get to talking about how we would apply this into each area. I started with music because that's what I'm most familiar with. So for music, our deep practice would look like this. We select a small excerpt of a challenging piece. So just a few measures, a few seconds of music. We pick a specific task that we want to work on in this piece. That could be the way that we are tonguing the note. Is it shorter, is it long? Where are we breathing? Is it even how it should be? Is the rhythm being played accurately? We don't want to focus on all of these at once. We want to pick something from that list and work it individually. The third thing we do is we try and complete the task. And the last thing on there is perhaps the most critical and the most neglected area of teaching that I've seen, which is having the student or the person attempting to learn the task stop and think about their own success. Did they succeed? If they succeeded, How is it that they succeeded? What did they do? Often when I'm teaching my students, I'll give them several different ways to approach the topic and see what works for them. And then I will ask them, okay, what did you do once they are successful in order to get yourself to sound this way? This was right, this was great. What did you do? 90% of the time, they say, I don't know. The sooner we can get our kids to recognize their own cognitive process and what it is that's making them successful, the faster they will be successful. If there was something that made it so they did not succeed in that time, it's also important to recognize that so they can see what it was that they did that didn't contribute to their success. Recognizing each of those keys is going to lead to more successful performance overall. We have 3 examples here. We're not going to get to watch all of them, just one. So I'll give you a brief overview of each of the videos, and then you get to take a vote. Yay! So up here in the corner, we have a cello teacher who is going to model some of the deep practice ideas and how he monitors his own performance and that of his students while they are practicing. Over here, we get to see a kid piano player using some of the principles of deep practice. And on the bottom, we have Mr. Banjo Man, the mustache makes it, playing on the banjo and using some of the principles of deep practice. So, if you would like to see our cello dude, raise your hand. Okay, if you would like to see the kid, raise your hand. And if you'd like to see Mr. Banjo Man, raise your hand. Okay, he's probably just slightly the kid. So, as we watch this, there are some things that she's doing really well in the deep practice, but there are also some things that she could be doing to have a more efficient practice session. So we're going to see if we can identify both of those as we watch her play. And if you're motion sick, you may want to look away. Okay, so she's really nailing one of the aspects of deep practice. Can anyone tell me what it is? Yes? The repetition. She is nailing that repetition. What is something that she hasn't done a lot of in her deep practice, Rory?
Not slowing it down enough to correct your mistake while she's doing it.
Good. She has not slowed it down to make it a comfortable speed for her to allow that myelinization of correct pathways to happen. Good. There's another thing as well. Yes?
She's not taking time to reflect.
Exactly. That's the one we always have trouble with. She's not taking time to reflect on her own performance. So if she wanted to make it even more effective, she'd stop after each one and think about her success. She could slow it down to help her to do it more accurately and to myelinate those pathways, which is excellent. Okay, so sports deep practice, our PE classes. You'll note that a lot of these steps are almost exactly identical to music steps. Amazing how much crossover there is here. So as we're teaching students a sport or a skill, we want to limit our task towards a simple and specific goal, whether that's footwork or a dribble drill or a passing drill or whatever it may be. I'm sure our PE teachers could think about 65 more, but you know, I'm not a PE teacher, so that was my best effort there. We're also going to try and complete that task once we've been given that task. And we need to remember to think about how we did on that task, whether we succeeded. If we succeeded, how did we succeed? What caused us to succeed? If we didn't then we can think about what we did that led to that outcome. And of course, all of this is done with no judgment whatsoever. One of the videos we didn't happen to watch was like, oh, perfectionism is so good in music. And I'm like, well, being able to identify where you want to be is good in music, but perfectionism assigns values to outcomes and what we want to do rather than assigning a ethical value to an outcome. Oh, you succeeded, you are a good person. Rather, what we want to do is, you tried so hard on this. That's great. I love that effort. Okay. So, we have 4 examples of sports here. I'll give a rundown as well. We've got a golf flip. I had never heard of that before, but apparently it's something that can happen in your swing at the end of it. This one is a basketball drill for more advanced students or more advanced people. This one is a little bit of futsal, I think I'm saying that correctly, game in Brazil, not to be confused with football. This is futsal. There are some differences. And down here in the bottom right, we have youth doing a ball handling drill. So raise your hands if you would like to see the golf flip. Okay, raise your hands if you would like to see the basketball drill for advanced players. Okay, raise your hand if you'd like to see the futsal. And for the dribbling practice. Okay, I think our most voted for was our futsal here. So, an interesting thing about futsal that makes it effective in deep practice is that the ball is heavier. It's making things more difficult. They compress the field size so that the average time the player is handling the ball increases by a great deal. So they've got that repetition aspect. They need to get really good at passing because there's not all this wide open space. So you can see there how much smaller the field is. One of the places they studied in the research of this book was why this particular area of Brazil was so successful in creating world championship soccer teams. And they found that the kids were playing this game from the time they were very young and didn't even get on a real soccer field until they were like 14 or 16 or something like that. So anytime we can increase the opportunities for a student to repeat something or to get more chances to practice the skill, that's going to lead to better outcomes for us. And click. So, some of our other subject areas. Here's some deep practice in some of our math, science, and history. There was a psychologist, Henry Roedinger, the University of St. Louis, who ran a study with his students, divided them into 2 groups. Group A studied the paper in 4 sessions. Group B studied once, but was tested 3 times throughout their learning cycle. A week later, both groups were tested on how well they had retained the knowledge. Group B scored 50% higher on average than Group A, even though they'd studied 1/4 as much, but they'd learned far more. One of the students who was talking about applied these same principles to her studying, raised her GPA by a full number in her grade point average. So this is really interesting in relation to the refinements that we're doing to our homework and making that efficient and making sure that students are getting the most bang for their buck in the time that they have. So how do we apply this here? Obviously, I'm not like a math or history teacher, but this was my attempt to apply these concepts to a subject area outside of my own. So feel free to make your own use of the data as well. So you could cut homework time by a significant amount by having the test 3 times throughout the cycle. We want to make sure that these principles of deep practice are being used throughout. But we do one at the beginning, one in the middle, one at the end. The first and second tests, the students should be evaluating their own performance on the test. If it's a math test, what skill are they lacking that caused them to miss this specific problem? And then students should be able to identify what that skill is. Are they not using the parentheses correctly? Are they not using the order of operations? What is the skill that they are lacking in order to perform it accurately? And throughout this cycle, rather than blanket, here's your homework, and a teacher with an idea of what concepts are being used on each problem within the homework could be like, oh, this student on the first test has this area they need work on, this area they need work on, this area they need to work on. These are the problems they should work on to bridge that gap. Of course, doing it this way would create interesting issues in how we would grade things. So here are some of my ideas on how to approach that. The first test could be based on participation, along with the second. As students are evaluating their own performance right now, we're caring about if they know what they did and how to improve rather than the actual outcome of the test. And then the third test could be graded as normally. Here is a short math video on deep practice.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another Minute Study Tip. Today we are talking about implementing the process of deep practice when studying for a standardized test. So what is deep practice? Deep practice is a term that was coined by Daniel Coyle, the author of one of my favorite books, The Talent Code. Deep practice is the general idea that when studying, you want to break down these large tasks into smaller bite-sized pieces, really focus, really pay attention, force yourself to practice in a way that forces you to make mistakes, evaluate those mistakes, and then try again. Now, this is the ultimate formula for really and truly mastering mathematics.
Okay, so we look at those 3 steps. As I reflect back on my own educational experiences, I had a lot of making mistakes and a lot of trying again. But once again, it was that second step that I found to be missing in most of my instruction, regardless of the subject, was evaluating the mistakes that I made. Why did I make the mistake? That's what is typically missing.
Mathematics. There's 2 other important essential elements of deep practice. Number 1 is you have to have an ignition point. This is a launching pad.
So spoilers, we're going to talk about that in a second.
You're pursuing. Now that may seem difficult when you're prepping for a standardized test, but I believe that if you look at it and approach it like a game that can be won, you can achieve that ignition. The second important component is that you must find a master coach. And now a master coach
Also,
for you
spoilers,
is different than a master coach for somebody else. It's a personal fit. It's all about chemistry as well as them having a masterful understanding of the topic matter. The most interesting part about deep practice is it not only enables you to perform well on a test, but it actually changes your brain chemistry.
Okay, so this next section we've talked about, basically the myelinization. For the sake of time, we're going to skip on here. So for literature and English, I have an example from the book, which is the Brontes example. Apparently, in a lot of biographies of this particular family, there were a lot of the biographers who said, oh, amazing talent that they were just somehow born with, and that's how it happened, because they were born with it. Genetically gifted, woo, eugenics, basically. But this biographer went back into what these kids were doing to actually make themselves into the successful writing family that they were. So, Barker was the biographer, and says that these first books lacked any signs of incipient genius.
Great.
He was not impressed.
I read that biography, and when you read their early stuff, it's garbage. I honestly believe you've got to produce a lot of garbage before you produce something worthwhile.
Exactly.
Their early stuff is awful.
So, preach, witness, right there. Awesome. Okay, so this is what the biographer says. Basically, they were awful. They were imitations of what they were reading at the time. Whether that was melodrama or fantasy, they were taking characters that were actually in the books and borrowing them. I know some of you in your heads are probably screaming, plagiarism. But we all know that one of the best ways to learn something is through imitation. So as long as we make it clear that once you're going to go out there and sell something or put it out as your own, we are not in the imitation realm, we are in the creation realm. But in the learning process, useful tools. Okay, so Barker notes the variety of these books that are there. Lots of different ones, 22 books with an average of 80 or so pages in a time period of 15 months. So they were writing continuously. Often it had fantastical elements, but as it's been said, they were pretty much trash. Once again, we're not concerned with the outcome. We are concerned with the process that will lead to a good outcome for our students later. As Barker put it, their slapdash writing, appalling spelling, and non-existent punctuation well into their late teenage years is usually glossed over, as well as their shallow characters. And he's like, when you look at what they wrote, you cannot say they were born novelists. If they were, their early stuff would be good. They got to the point where they had multiple successful authors in the same family by practice and repetition and the principles of deep practice. So I was thinking about what are things that we are doing or could do in our English or literature classrooms that hit these principles, and one of them that I thought of that we are already doing is The Biggest Writer. The goal being, of course, to write a story with as many words as possible to get the volume out there, practice writing, practice writing. We could, in these classrooms, write short stories in the style of each piece of literature we read. If we're doing a short story, we could share characters or settings or themes or styles. So we're going to write a short story, we're going to use the same theme, we're going to use something like that, and that's the assignment to get them to do that. Rewriting a story, but changing an element like theme. So you've got this story, you read it. Okay, how would this story be different if we changed the theme of the story? Write a new ending. An idea like that. But writing often is one of the biggest keys, that repetition and making sure, of course, as always, that we think about our performance. So our math dude talked about ignition, and ignition is basically the spark that lights the fire in the students to learn. The quote here compares it to an engine. here are some ignition events around the world that led to hotbed development in certain areas that had uncharacteristically large groups of successful people coming from small areas. So first of these is South Korea in 1998 with 20-year-old Se-Ri Pak. She wins the McDonald's LPGA championship and was the only South Korean in the competition that year. 9 years later, there were 33 in that competition. Many of you have probably heard of Anna Kournikova. 17-year-old tennis player from Russia who went to the Wimbledon semifinals. That year, there were 3 women in the WTA 100 from Russia, and by 2004, they were regularly showing up. By 2007, half of the top 10 were Russians, and 12 of the top 50. If that isn't disproportionate, I don't know what is. We've got the first person to break the 4-minute mile, medical student Robert Bannister in 1954. A few weeks after he broke the 4-minute mile, someone else did it. Within the next year, a few more did, and then in 3 years, 17 did. These are all ignition events. People saw in these people, whether it's Se-Ri Pak or Anna Kournikova or this medical student, they saw, oh, this person is like me. They succeeded. I can succeed. What's different about them than me? So, a question we should ask ourselves about these things is, why is there a gap between the ignition event and hotbed development? Why do you think that might be? So ignition event being when the first person from that area did it, and then years later, why does it take that long for so many in that area? Exactly. It's time intensive. It takes a long time to develop the talents, especially in these examples at the world-class level. It takes time. So there's an interesting link between ignition and commitment. There was a study done in 1997 by a man named Gary McPherson, who was looking at a batch of 157 music students. He wanted to know why some were advancing more quickly than others. And he took 9 months to look at this. In that 9-month period of time, the students fell neatly along the bell curve. And so he looked at areas that he thought, oh yeah, these are the traditionally thought of things that make people successful in music. RL sensitivity. Then he looked at his results. No correlation. Math skills. Can they count? They have a relationship between numbers. No correlation. Sense of rhythm. Can they keep a beat when they start? No correlation. Sensory motor skills. Are they able to move one finger at a time individually without moving the others? Are they coordinated? Well, no correlation there. Income level of the family. No correlation. This blew his mind. He was like, why are all of these traditionally thought of areas that lead to success in music showing no correlation in the results? And then he remembered one of the first questions that it asked the kids at the very beginning, probably not as a conscious theme, but just as, a question he asked. How long do you think you'll play your instrument? That was the question. as he took that question, he grouped his students by data outcomes into 3 groups: long-term committers, medium-term committers, and short-term committers. What he discovered is that those who were in the long-term groups outperformed short-term groups by an impressive 400%. Even more interestingly is when he compared the practice time of those who were only doing 20 minutes but were committed for the long term versus those who were doing an hour and a half daily but were committed for the short term. He found that those people practicing for 20 minutes were outperforming those practicing for an hour and a half, consistently across the board. Unsurprisingly, the group that was most successful were the long-term committers and those that practiced the most. This graph shows the results that he got, and we can see that here. This is our long-term committers. You can see that even at that 20-minute low of practicing, they're outperforming the people who were spending an hour and a half practicing by a significant margin. So ignition can happen as an outside event when people see something on TV or they're at an event and they're like, ooh, that can be me. But often, as a teacher, our students come in without a pre-existing ignition. And that's where master coaching or teaching comes in. This quote is one that I really liked because of its correlation and applicability to our Glenn Latham philosophies. Perhaps the major quality of these teachers was that they made the initial learning very pleasant and rewarding. Much of the introduction to the field was as a playful activity. And the learning at the beginning of the stage was much like a game. The teachers gave much positive reinforcement and only rarely were critical of the child. However, they did set standards and expected the child to make progress, although this was largely done with approval and praise. Sounds familiar, right? So, how do we be master teachers? As I was thinking about it, I came up with a few things we can do to help ourselves be the master teacher or coach that we want to be. First one is be age appropriate. We all know that we don't teach a kindergarten class in the same way we teach 8th grade. That would be a disaster in either direction. So, know your grade level and do what works for them. Our next one is to be concise. Yesterday, our lecturer was giving really good examples of how talking can be used to build relationships. Funny thing, talking and building relationships. In teaching, that's also what we want to use our talking as, for the large part. We want to minimize lectures as much as we can and maximize our time to build relationships with the kids when we're talking. So we give them enough instruction so they can do one step, have them do the step, and then move on to the next thing. Step by step. Otherwise, we get that information overload. I know sometimes before the school year, we get all this information and I'm like, oh my goodness. Fire hose face, how can I absorb all of this information? If you felt there, this is a principle that you can probably relate to, is having just enough information to do one step and apply it. Here's an example of concise coaching from the book. We've got 11-year-old Casey and her teacher, Linda Septian. Casey sings, and her feedback is, okay, it's a dance song, it's not pretty, it's a power ballad, it moves quick, be quick, sing it like a trumpet. Casey sings again. Linda's next instruction focuses on the next thing she can do. Add a scat on the end, sing it like this, you know how much he cares, whatever. Then Casey will sing again. And now she's giving her instructions on how to fade the ending. how to end the phrase. Should be like a balloon running out of air. She sings again. New instruction. Use your diaphragm, not your face. Hold your tongue tighter there for a clearer sound. Even with just these levels, this far into the lesson, can you imagine if she had said all of these things at once? Okay, Casey, I'd like you to sing this song, and it's a dance song, it's not pretty, it's a power ballad, it moves quick, sing it like a trumpet, add a scat on the end, cares, fake the ending like a balloon, use your diaphragm, not your face, make your tongue tight, get your cheeks back on the scats. I mean, just overwhelming. The kid would be able to do nothing. So, showcasing, pick one theme, let the kid do it. Once they've done that, give them something else. And of course, practice is a part of this. You've got to go practice it. Okay, there is a big correlation between being specific and good results from our students. So I've got some example of what good Latham looks like or sounds like and some bad Latham. And I think I've heard all of those that are in the other column at one point or another, either from me or someone else. So good Latham, specificity is directly related to sincerity. If we are giving someone praise or a compliment, but we don't know specifically what we're praising them on, it's probably a good indication that that praise is not sincere. Kids pick up on that. If you can't be sincere about what it is you're saying, don't give that praise. Find something else you can praise. Must be specific. So in our bad Latham category, thanks for being quiet, everybody. You look around and nobody is quiet. Or, I like how you are all ready. Fingers and noses, all sorts of things going on, but nobody is ready. This is one of my favorites. Thanks for walking in the halls, and they are running. So, sometimes I think we are reluctant to use our reminders. Reminders are not negatives, they are reminders. We can say, okay, we walk in the hall. That's not a negative, that's a reminder. Or, on the top one, okay, now it's time to be quiet. Then you look and see who has followed through. Then by name, you say, oh, Gracie, thank you so much for being quiet. I can see that you're ready to go now. We make it specific and honest. Good job can be a tricky one. Students have to know who it is that's done a good job and why the job is good. If you say that and they know how they are doing a good job and why, then good job is fine. But if they don't, then you want to avoid that. Hey, be the teacher your student needs. Sometimes your teacher or your classroom needs you to be the hyper outgoing teacher. Sometimes they need you to be more mellow. It all depends on the classroom dynamic. You've just got to be what your classroom needs. I think it's interesting that both our lecturer yesterday and I talked about Timmy being the bad example. I don't know what it is about Timmy, his name. We need to